Hello there everyone, this is Mr. Brass, and today I'll be going over Christian apologist David Woods again. Now this will be a bit of a different video, as I will not be going into religion as much here, but rather I'll be addressing topics relevant to men's rights activism. David, like a liberal feminist, has a chronic addiction to gynocentrism, and that has to be treated with debunkings.
Take the recent exodus from Afghanistan following the Taliban takeover. We've seen footage of people at the Kabul airport trying to get out of Afghanistan by clinging to the side of a U.S. military jet. Do you notice anything about the people who are trying to force their way out of Afghanistan? They seem to be overwhelmingly grown men. Here's a now famous picture from inside the C-17. These are people who forced their way into a jet that was about to leave the Kabul airport. The U.S. military decided to take off rather than try to force the people off the jet. Now, there are some women and children here, but I'd say that 75 to 80% of the people on board are grown men.
Why is this a surprise to you, David? Grown men, on average, are faster than women, so the fact they are more able to run and catch a jet is no surprise. As sports physician Dr. Emily Cross in a Live Science article says, a man's leg is about 80% muscle compared with about 60% muscles in a woman's leg. That extra muscle can help men run faster. You mentioned this fact later on, so you can't be surprised. Why shouldn't men take advantage of this?
Who are the people who are best able to fend for themselves in a dangerous, war-torn area? Grown men are best able to fend for themselves in a dangerous, war-torn area. But who are the people who are best able to flee a dangerous, war-torn area? Grown men are best able to flee a dangerous, war-torn area. The people who are best able to fend for themselves are simultaneously the people who are best able to run and leave everyone else behind. And that's why we need rules, my friends.
You say that they are leaving people behind. How do you know, David, that the men didn't run so they could raise the money to be able to bring their family back with them? Also, even assuming most of these men are in fact single, they have no obligation to stay behind and get tortured and killed by violent terrorists with guns for the sake of being expendable. A broke man fleeing from there likely would be an easy picking for a militia group armed with state-of-the-art American tech. So it's not like we're talking about men staying behind so that there can be a fair fight. In a world where guns exist and the population is in the billions, the traditional reasons for male disposability are a moot point. Any woman can kill any man given she has a gun or some weapon that levels the playing field. Also, unlike in ancient times and places where underpopulation was a serious concern, in blindly protecting women, no matter the cost meant the difference between survival and extinction, that is no longer an obstacle most of the world has to deal with.
Now, which people were best able to get into lifeboats if they really wanted to? The grown men. But most of the grown men died. Which people were least able to get into lifeboats? Women and children. But most of the women and children survived. What does this mean? It means that most of the men who were on the Titanic would rather die than trample on women and children to save themselves.
Or it could mean that they weren't allowed to get on the boats even if they were there first. That means the coward's way out wasn't an option, even to men that wanted to save their lives over others. That means the people in charge of the lifeboats valued the lives of women over men. It is also good to note that your graph lumps all children together and doesn't separate them into boys and girls. How much would you be willing to bet, David, that the number of little boys that died on the Titanic outnumbered the number of little girls? What would be your excuse for that? Would you say that while it is objectively the case that the little boys had at best slim chances of getting to a lifeboat on their own, that it was better that they died over the little girls because Yahweh really would prefer heaven being populated by little boys? Also, given the fact that more people could have been saved had they let more on the lifeboats reach match capacity. Many men and boys' lives were lost for objectively no reason whatsoever. It should also be noted that twice as many second-class men survived as first-class children, so your example doesn't entirely work. More men dying can also be attributed to the fact more men were on board to begin with.
What's going on here? Why are grown men leaving their wives and mothers and sisters and children, expecting their wives and mothers and sisters and children to fend for themselves against terrorists?
Once again, it could be the case they left so that they could make money and work on getting their wives and children out over time. Him getting killed by a group of violent terrorists really doesn't do his family any good, and the family winds up in the exact same place they would have been if he had left. At the very least, the family can take comfort that one of their family members survived if things really get out of hand. Also, the men could know that the Taliban is more likely not to kill the women because needlessly killing women is seen as dishonorable in that culture. According to a UN report, men comprised 52% of all civilian casualties compared to women who make up 14%. 32% were children, and when you break that down, you get 20% boys to 12% girls. So those groups have no problem with killing men and do so at a much greater rate. So wouldn't it make sense that the group at the most danger of actually being killed should be given some leeway in the decisions they make? It is also possible that due to the polygamy that goes on in those cultures, that many of these men don't have dependents, and they are basically on their own as their culture has nothing to do with them.
How would you not rather die than abandon women and children? How is that C-17 not filled with women and children?
Easy. It is this little thing you should have picked up on in biology class. It is called self-preservation. Self-preservation is something I live by because, unlike you, David, I don't believe in a happy time fun camp in the sky that will reward me for my sacrifice. If I get my head blown off by a terrorist with a shotgun, I don't see myself partying with Jesus in the next life. I'll be worm food.
Look, the principle here is very simple. And the more general principle doesn't just apply to men, it applies to everyone. Sometimes certain people have an advantage over other people. It could be a political advantage, it could be a financial advantage, it could be an intellectual advantage, it could be an advantage in status and strength and all kinds of things. There will be times when it's perfectly acceptable to use your advantage to your advantage. But there will be other times when the right thing to do is to use your advantage to help people who don't have that advantage.
Basically, the argument is that because, through no fault of their own, men were born to be faster than women on average, they should essentially handicap themselves by doing the social equivalent of wearing concrete shoes to a race and letting people have a 10-minute head start because, you know, reasons.
In Islam, the message seems to be, if you have an advantage, if you're bigger, if you're stronger, if you have a majority, whatever, you use that advantage to oppress and trample on everyone else. You don't use your advantage to help the disadvantaged. You use your advantage for yourself and to force everyone to obey the commands of an illiterate 7th century Arabian caravan robber.
So what you're saying is that Muhammad, peace be upon him, was actually more in line with men's rights than Christianity? I don't think that is a good argument in favor of Christianity if you're looking to convert people.
Apostle Paul said, "Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her." Christ was crucified for the church. According to the Bible, then, husbands should be ready to be crucified for their wives if the situation arises.
That, as you said, would only apply to married men. So basically, if you don't want to be treated like a disposable piece of trash under Christianity, men, whatever you do, don't get married. Even if you got the girl pregnant and the father has a shotgun to your head, saying, "Marry my daughter or I'll blow your head off," it would be far more honorable to say, "Shoot me," and actually get killed by the father, than it would be to subject yourself to a glorified version of slavery by saying, "Yes, I do."
You see, When your supreme moral example is someone who endured torture and death for the sake of others, it has an impact on what you view as right and wrong.
Jesus died because he, under Roman law, committed treason, and according to the definition of treason at the time, and assuming the Bible is an accurate source for quotes from Jesus, he objectively did by claiming that the Romans would face Judgment Day and giving himself titles that have a political ring to it. Now, just because I believe Jesus did commit treason, that doesn't mean I believe he should have died. Treason doesn't merit death in my opinion, especially if you did so because you believed your people were being mistreated. The Romans had no care about religious disputes amongst Jews. As long as they didn't talk about the emperor, they were fine with letting religions sort themselves out. Jesus also had himself killed because he wanted his message to spread, and him being a martyr could allow that.
The supreme moral example is someone who had sex with a prepubescent girl and took the wife of his own adopted son after causing the divorce by lusting after her, and had sex with his slave girls and tortured a man for money and taught his followers to beat their wives into submission. In other words, a violent, selfish man.
David makes a lot of charges at Muhammad, peace be upon him. I'm going to try to play a bit of a devil's advocate on these charges, as I do find some of them problematic myself. When it comes to Aisha, it should be noted that this was a divine command from Allah. David, I'm sure you believe in divine command theory, so you should know the morality of it. Now, what seems objectively worse, David? Following a command from God to kill or chase out women and children from land, or following a command to marry a child? Now, to me, at least, I find wiping people out to be a lot more of a trouble to deal with than the Aisha situation. Muhammad's, peace be upon him, situation wouldn't apply to anyone else, as they weren't commanded like Muhammad, peace be upon him, to do so. Asadullah Ali Al-Andalusiand, sorry I butchered that, wrote a paper called Understanding Aisha's Age, an Interdisciplinary Approach, where it goes over how Islamic law teaches a system of unchanging moral principles with flexible application. The marriageable age was puberty, whenever that occurred, and people often confuse contractual marriages with sexual marriages. A child or childs could be contracted to marry someone or each other at a young age, but no sexual contact be made. Muhammad, peace be upon him, contracted a marriage with Aisha when she was 6 and waited until she got mature at 9. I'd recommend reading the full article for the argument. Now, for the took the wife of his adopted son thing, this is referring to the situation between Zayd and Zanib. Zayd was an ex-slave that Muhammad, peace be upon him, liberated. It should be noted that Zanib originally thought she was marrying Muhammad, peace be upon him, but Muhammad, peace be upon him, insisted on Zayd marrying her. She didn't like that because she considered Zayd to be unworthy due to his past slavery. Eventually, despite Muhammad's, peace be upon him, insistent they stayed married, they got divorced, and Muhammad, peace be upon him, I imagine felt a bit responsible as he insisted on the marriage and decided to honor her relatives' wishes and Zanib's, and they got married. So in my opinion, this is a story of course correction. Now, some commentators like Maulana Muhammad Ali reject the story as an absurd story to harm Muhammad, peace be upon him. It is said, what was it then which prevented the Prophet from marrying her when she was a virgin? Had he not seen her before? He was so closely related to her that on the face of it, such a supposition is absurd. Then there was no seclusion of women before Zanib's marriage with the Prophet, a fact the truth of which is attested by Mir himself, having not only seen her when she was a virgin, but knowing her fully well on account of her close relationship to him, and her early belief in Islam, while both she and her relatives were desirous that the Prophet should take her for a wife. What hindered the Prophet from marrying her? The story is so absurd that any man possessing ordinary common sense would unhesitatingly reject it. However, Personally, I like to take a challenge, and will assume it is historical. It should be noted, however, that Sayyid Hassan Aznazir, again, sorry for butchering that, in his commentary book does give the background that Muhammad, peace be upon him, was aware of people like David's objection, that he would ask them to divorce so he could get the girl, and in fact he told them to stay married to sway that objection, even though he had feelings. So he was restraining himself and trying to avoid David's objection. Now, in regards to sex with slave girls, it doesn't state that this was forced onto the slave girls or captured female war captives. Quran 4:24 says specifically not to compel them to prostitution. This had partially to do with female war captives whom men were worried about marrying because they often were the wives of their enemies whom were dead. Now the reason for this is pretty simple. It is to ensure that the women captured would have some protection and not be basically left on their own to essentially die. Marrying female war captives wasn't encouraged in Quran 4:3, but rather it was allowed on special conditions, such as when someone couldn't afford to marry a free woman, or in the event of a war where many men died and the female war captive needs more protection. Properly speaking, this simply meant men should only marry women they can support and honor their marriage with. Ultimately, it is concerned with the just treatment of dependents. These considerations apply to Quran 33:50 through 52. Now, about the Jew he tortured for money, this refers to an incident with Kinana ibn Al-Rabi, a Jewish Arab tribal leader. Many scholars have addressed this and said the reason he was killed was not because he didn't reveal where the treasure was, but because he murdered Mamun ibn Masalama. Again, sorry for butchering these names. The story is bizarre because Muhammad, peace be upon him, had no need for money, had turned down money before, and the torture methods were forbidden. Lastly, with the beat their wives into submission thing. Now, some argue that this really means the man leaves the wife and not really to strike her. I feel that that interpretation would be far too easy of an explanation, so I'll, for the sake of argument, assume the to strike her is the correct interpretation. People that hold to that view argue that it is a last resort and should be avoided at all costs, and it is to arguably what would be worse for the community, i.e. divorce. If it is to occur, it is unanimous amongst commentators who take that view, say that it has to be non-injurious and not to inflict pain. Think about being tapped with a twig, not beaten. No classical commentator or Islamic legal scholar say that this is a license to grievously harm one's wife, and many say given the steps it takes to get to that situation, it can be considered a ban on wife beatings just for being angry. Being seriously harmed by your husband is grounds in many Islamic schools for divorce. They say this is just to alter behavior, not to punish. From a Western lens, we obviously know of situations where it is okay to lay your hands on your wife. For one, in the context of self-defense or protection, say she has gone crazy and is going to go at you or the kids with a knife, or say she's a danger to herself and the family unit, and you go and shake her. The latter would apply here, as the action she was taking put her, and by consequence, the family unit in danger.
Your religion. But let me tell you this, in a spirit of true love, you need a new religion.
I recommend if you or a Muslim want a new God belief system, you'd be better off going to deism. In deism, you don't have to worry about having to spend hours trying to justify why God commanded X, or why God acted in Y reason. You can use pure, unbridled, and uncensored reason to get to God, and you're fine from there, without any unnecessary additions. Well, that is all for today. This is Mr. Brass saying goodbye and get wise.